When I was first a student journalist, I didn't envision that I would be writing full-time about this particular beat on Antifa or the far left. At that time, in 2016, 2017, very few people in the mainstream had really heard of Antifa, particularly in the United States. But the subject actually ended up confronting me face to face, literally. I was a student journalist in November 2016, covering the reactions in my city of Portland, Oregon, after Donald Trump was announced to have won the election. And the reaction in my city and in many left-wing cities in America was rage and fury at the surprise outcome and a rejection of the electoral democratic process. More than 10,000 people for my small city took to the streets, and within that there was a faction of people in black bloc, so dressed head to toe in black with their faces covered, carrying weapons, smashing up parts of downtown Portland, setting fires in the street. And I was so shocked covering it. You know, I was just a student journalist working for a small student paper, and instead of that being a one-off night of political violence and extremism in my city and in many cities in America, these extremist groups organizing ostensibly under the banner of anti-fascism or anti-racism continued to carry out acts of violence for the next 4.5 years. And it culminated in the riots of 2020, where dozens of cities in America were besieged by unrest and violence and riots after the death of George Floyd. In the Pacific Northwest of America, where I'm from and where I was living at the time, that's where we had the worst violence. My city of Portland had more than 120 days of nightly riots carried out by Antifa and their allies in Black Lives Matter. In nearby Seattle, there was a so-called autonomous zone that was set up where extremists took over 6 city streets and created a hard border that had checkpoints and had people carrying guns, rifles, and pistols and knives, determining who could enter and who could leave. And that went on for several weeks, and it led to multiple shootings and several people getting murdered there. I documented the origin story of Antifa in Europe and how it was exported to the United States in the 80s, and how it had an explosion in membership and in participation after the election of Donald Trump. One of the biggest propaganda strategies of Antifa is how they're able to convince the public and the mainstream that their movement or ideology is simply just being against fascism. When it's branded that way, certainly a lot of people would be sympathetic to it. I was sympathetic to it. We have the history of the 20th century. I'm speaking to you in Europe right now, where the brutality of fascist ideologies and the millions of lives that it took leaves a lasting memory on people who were victimized and those whose families suffered immensely. Antifa use that history and exploit it to say that there are fascist movements now that are in the mainstream who are organizing in public that we must destroy. The thing is, the label of who Antifa calls fascist is very wide, and that's intentional. And how they define fascism today is also ever expanding and changing by the day. The origins of the contemporary Antifa movement started in the 60s and 70s in West Germany by leftist activist students who were sympathetic to the Soviet Union and communism and wanted to protest against liberal democracy in West Germany. broadly, their ideology has actually very little, the ideology of Antifa today has actually very little to do with being against fascism. That's certainly part of it, but really it's about anarchism and communism. And how they define, or actually poorly define, fascism is very important, because they view the, liberal democratic societies such as in the United States, in Western Europe, in France, in Germany today, they view these as fascist states. And so using that as their belief and their mandate, they believe that they can carry out acts of violence against the state. But they also believe that they have a mandate to carry out violence and intimidation against political opponents. So they will cast aspersions on political targets, accusing anyone and anybody, including people on the left, of being fascist. Anybody who dares to stand up against their extremism, anybody who speaks truth about what Antifa actually believe, is labeled a fascist. That's a lesson, a hard lesson that I learned back in starting around 2018. At that time in Portland, I was covering some of the protests and riots that were being organized by Antifa, and I was writing critically about them. Not so much about the ideology, because I knew not very much about it at the time, but rather on what I was seeing, which was that they were assaulting people who were engaging in activities, First Amendment protected activities, free speech, free expression activities. Antifa didn't believe that these people had a right to it, and in fact, they believed it was their duty to assault and hurt these people. And I was writing against that as a matter of principle. And then I was subjected to violence in 2019 in the summer while covering one of their many, many protests turned riots. I became the target of a mob of them who beat me severely on the head and the face, and then stole my camera equipment and doused me with dozens of so-called milkshakes. We don't really know what those drinks were. It blinded me in that moment. I couldn't even see where to leave. I ended up hospitalized and was diagnosed as a brain hemorrhage. And then 2.5 years later, in Portland in May of 2021, I returned to do some undercover field reporting, and they discovered me, pulled off my mask, and beat me in the streets of downtown Portland. And I've had no justice in either one of those situations of being a victim. And it demonstrates, I think, what we're seeing in America is that people, local governments, local politicians are either supportive of Antifa, or they're so afraid to stand up to it that those who are victimized by this violent extremist ideology and movement don't get any support really through the criminal justice system, and certainly no support from the press. In fact, I've been demonized, salvaged by the mainstream media, who argue that I deserved the assaults and what happened to me, and the death threats, the intimidations, the people showing up at my home to intimidate my family and to try to kill me, that I deserved all of that because I dared to write critically about Antifa. Again, it's this, the whole name is a misnomer. Antifa will argue, and they know that this is a propaganda tactic when they say, if you are against Antifa, that means you're pro-fascism. That's a simplistic way of looking at the entire argument, but it's also a lie, more importantly. My parents fled a communist regime. They lived through war. My parents were political refugees to the United States from the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. And so growing up and coming into adulthood, I think that family upbringing helped me to understand that freedom should not be taken for granted, that free speech and freedom of expression is not just a given that everybody has access to. With that sort of as, I guess, a context for my upbringing, I wrote Unmasked because I see a threat to freedom in Western liberal democratic societies, that people are not aware of this threat because they're being fooled by the name. They're getting misled into thinking that this is just about being against anti-fascism, when really it's actually about destabilizing local governments, destabilizing the state, with an explicit agenda of actually, at a future point, overthrowing the state. And if in the worldview of Antifa, like, violence is not an anomaly or a bug, but rather a feature of it. They, by their own literatures and texts and own statements, they believe that we need to do, fascism has to be stopped by any means necessary. And again, this has to go back to, how do they define fascism? They define you and me, the state, as fascist. And by any means necessary means using violence, and if needed, to kill and be killed, as has happened in the United States in 2019. I document the threat to freedom, particularly in the United States, just because I think people outside the United States still look to the US as sort of this shining beacon of protection of free expression and liberties that are enshrined in our founding state documents. But we have extremist ideologies and extremist movements and militant activists who are really chipping away at it. And they're doing it in a very deceitful way, because they are claiming to be fighting for racial justice and social justice. So this undermining of freedom is happening right before our eyes. The activities, a lot of it is clandestine and hidden, yes, as I document and unmask in my book, but a lot of it is done openly. The riots are done in front of so many CCTV cameras, and in front of many independent journalists capture this footage. And then in their own statements and in their own literatures that they disseminate. So I guess Unmasked is a cautionary tale, I think, for readers outside the United States to look and see of what can happen in states that are so-called have developed democracies and a long history of the rule of law. It's not immune to threats to challenge it to an overthrow. I think following the post-war World War II period, there's just this complacency by the victors of the Second World War, the US and its allies, that we've reached the end of history, that how life is now is how life will always be. And that's naive. In the final chapter of my book, in the afterword, I write about my family's story, my parents' story of how they settled in the United States after fleeing the communist reunification of Vietnam in 1975. Both of them experienced suffering in a prison camp for different reasons. My mother came from a middle-class family. Her parents owned property, so they were bourgeois, and that was their sin, so they were sent to labor camp. My mother was just a child. She was pulled out of school and languished in a prison camp, doing hard labor with the rest of her siblings and her parents. My father worked as a rookie police officer in a provincial town, very entry level, but that was seen as working for the former government, so that he was sent to re-education camp. That was the story of hundreds of thousands of people who suffered through these re-education camps and prison camps after 1975. Many of them fled literally on small, unworthy seaboats to neighboring countries in Southeast Asia where there were UN refugee camps. The West really opened its arms to take in so many of these refugees France took in a very large number, as well did Australia, Canada, and the United States, of course. I wrote about this at the end of the book, and it's not so much related to Antifa, but a lot of people have asked me, Andy, what's your story? Why do you continue writing about Antifa given the assaults that have happened to you, the death threats, the security issues that have forced you to have to leave Portland and to never be able to live there again for safety reasons? And I wrote about my family and myself in the last chapter, which is typically not done by journalists. They don't usually involve themselves in the story, but I got pulled into the story when I began reporting on Antifa. I share that story because it's a letter of gratitude to the country that took in my family and took in so many refugees from Vietnam. And it really breaks my heart that you have extremists from within trying to destroy liberty and freedom, ostensibly under this noble cause of being against fascism or racism. And they're carrying out acts of violence against other civilians, wantonly, indiscriminately at times. And if you turn on the television, you look on to see what the news commentators and the establishment press are saying, you would leave with a completely different understanding of Antifa. You would think that these are just people fighting against racism, against fascism, when the reality on the ground is these are violent extremists who believe that it's okay to assault people for their speech and for their thought. And the political currents that affect the United States are unfortunately exported to other parts around the world. We're seeing how American leftist identitarian politics has taken root in the United Kingdom and also in France, very much so. And France is a very ethnically and culturally diverse country like the United States. And what I worry is to see people, instead of truly celebrating diversity, exploiting it and using it as tinder to try to incite racial unrest, incite political violence. They've been very successful in the United States. Certainly all it really takes is one viral video of a police encounter with a criminal suspect and no context behind that for a whole narrative and a whole movement to besiege cities. And France is not immune to that. In 2020, after George Floyd died, from coast to coast in America, American cities were besieged by protesters and violent extremists who ostensibly were protesting for racial justice, but left a wake of destruction and violence. That violence was not entirely spontaneous and grassroots, as many have led the public to believe. The violence that happened took determination, organizing, and purpose. And Unmasked tells the story of how that happened, as well as how the origin story of some of these militant extremist groups that organized years before 2020 to exploit the death of George Floyd to carry out their political agenda of violence and rampage. My book, Unmasked, unveils the individuals, ideologies, groups, and movements that have been involved in carrying out unprecedented political violence in the United States and abroad, ostensibly, falsely, under the name of anti-fascism. I've been spending 2021 in Europe and in the UK. I was forced to leave my home in Portland, Oregon for security and safety reasons because of the people who continually threaten and promise and take steps to try to kill me. While here, I get to see really on the ground how, in a different political context, Antifa is able to mobilize and to organize. And it varies from country to country, but again, I'm seeing this is very similar patterns of same propaganda, same strategies, same manipulation of the press, manipulation of public emotions, with the goal of destabilizing society. And I think what's next for me is to dive deeper into the contemporary Antifa manifestations in continental Europe as well as Britain. Because what I see is that there's a tinderbox that's really potentially ready to ignite at any moment, when any of these countries can also have their own so-called George Floyd moment that is exploited by ideologues and extremists.